Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 7, Species Interactions, Ecological Succession, and Population Control. So in part 1, we dealt with species interactions. Now in part 2, we are going to talk about ecological succession and then population control. So starting off here, how do communities and ecosystems respond to changing environmental conditions? Well, we call it ecological succession. That's how they respond. Ecological succession is the normally gradual change in structure and species composition in any given system. So there are two types of ecological succession you're going to have to know about for this class. The first is primary and the second is secondary. So primary ecological succession involves the gradual establishment of communities in lifeless areas. Need to build up fertile soil or aquatic sediments to support plant communities. And pioneer species are usually the first species that show up when primary ecological succession is occurring. And those pioneer species, examples of them would be lichens and mosses. So what is the main key with primary ecological succession? Primary ecological succession starts with bare rock. That's the key. That's going to be the difference between primary and secondary, which we'll learn about in a second. Secondary starts off with soil. Primary ecological succession starts off with just bare rock. Then over time, the rock basically weathers a little bit, and you get lichens and mosses, which are your pioneer species to come in. This continues to weather the rock, which then begins to turn the rock into soil. Then we get small herbs and shrubs can kind of grow in that soil. As you get more organic material, the soil becomes a little thicker, the soil becomes more richer in nutrients, and then you're able to get bigger and bigger trees to be able to grow in that location. So again, this is primary ecological succession, starts off with bare rocks, and then over time, pioneer species come in, lichens and mosses, start to create soil, and then over time you get a better, more deeper soil regime, and that then can support bigger trees and more organic life. So that's pretty much primary ecological succession. In a lake, now that's in a terrestrial biome. In an aquatic biome, primary ecological succession looks a bit different. Basically, this occurs where sediments and plants have been gouged out from a lake bottom, maybe by a glacier. What happens is over time, nutrients flow into the lake. The soil, leaves, decaying matter end up sinking to the bottom. The sediments end up piling up, and eventually the lake fills up, and now you have a terrestrial habitat. So this is kind of the same thing that goes on land, but happens in a lake or some kind of pond or things like that. Again, you have this lake that has been gouged out, maybe from some sort of glacier. Over time, plant growth, sediment, decaying matter flow into the lake and begin to fill the lake up. And then eventually you get to the point where the lake is totally filled up, and now you have a terrestrial environment or a terrestrial biome there, and no longer an aquatic biome. So again, this is your example. These are your two examples of primary ecological succession. Secondary ecological succession, again, is a little different. Secondary ecological succession is a series of terrestrial communities or ecosystems developed in places with soil or sediment already there. So again, primary ecological succession, we just have bare rock. In secondary ecological succession, you do have soil. So examples of this would be an abandoned farmland, burned or cut down forest, or maybe flooded land, right? You flood land, you basically destroy the land, but you leave behind soil and sediment. So that isn't primary ecological succession. That would be secondary ecological succession. Factors that affect how fast this succession happens: facilitation of an area by one species for another. This could actually hinder some growth as well. So these are some of the factors that affect that rate. Here is your example of secondary ecological succession. Again, the big difference: you don't don't notice the bare rocks here at the beginning. We have soil there, so you don't need pioneer species to come in to continue to break down the rock into soil. You can just start growing weeds and grasses right in the soil, and then over time you basically get a mature forest to form in that area. Again, this is your example of secondary ecological succession. The big difference, soil is there at the beginning in secondary ecological succession. All right, so living systems are sustained through constant change. So we need a couple of terms here to know. The first is inertia. This is the ability of a living system to survive moderate disturbances. Resilience is the ability of a living system to be restored through secondary succession after a moderate disturbance. So, is there a balance of nature? The traditional view stated that yes, ecological succession eventually proceeds to a stable climax community, and this equilibrium is called the balance of nature. However, the current view is a little different than that. We don't believe now that succession leads to a stable climax community. What we think is that succession leads to a more complex, diverse, and resilient ecosystem that can sustain or withstand changes if they're not too large or too sudden. So they are resilient, but not necessarily stable, right? There's always constant change going on in these ecosystems. So the view currently is that succession does lead to more complex, diverse, and resilient ecosystems that can withstand changes to them, but not necessarily equilibrium or a balance, that there always is still some sort of change going on in that ecosystem. So again, that is the more current view. So again, definitely understand the differences between the traditional view and the more current view that we are seeing now. All right, so that was ecological succession. Now our final part of chapter 7 is to talk about population control. So what limits the growth of populations? Well, what is a population? A population is a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species. Population size may increase, decrease, or remain the same in response to changing environmental conditions. And scientists will use sampling techniques to estimate the population of a certain organism or species. Population distribution. Most populations live together in clumps or groups. Organisms cluster for resources and for protection from predators. Variables that govern the change in a population size will be births, right? Add to that population. Deaths, which will take away from the population, immigration, which adds to the population, and emigration, which takes away from the population. There's also the age structure, which is the distribution of individuals among various age groups. We have pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive stages, and we're actually going to investigate this in depth when we get to chapter 8, which is coming up next. We'll talk more about age structure and distribution of individuals with various age groups come chapter 8. So here are just some examples of how organisms kind of deal with one another, right? So the first is clumped, which is most organisms kind of living together in groups. Second time would be uniform, like this type of bush that basically just kind of grows uniformly in the desert. And then random would be like dandelions, which basically wherever the seeds happen to land, that's where the dandelion grows. Okay, so understand these three ways that we get population here, how populations interact with one another. These are your three main ways. So how do scientists sample population? Just a critical concept. Characterization of populations can be either qualitative or quantitative. We basically use something called the quadrat sampling that can be used to determine the abundance, density, and distribution of species. Basically, scientists will mark and recapture sampling, and that's used to estimate the size of a population in a defined area. So just again, there's a little critical concept in your book about sampling populations. Definitely make sure you read that page or pages. I think it's 1 or 2 pages. All right, so several factors can limit population size. Each population has a range of tolerance. That is the variation in the physical and chemical environment under which it can survive. So we have limiting factors, right? Precipitation, basically on land. water temperature, depth, clarity, and other factors in aquatic environments will be limiting factors to how large a population can get. And also population density, density dependent factors also will lead to determining how large a population can get. So the first we're looking at is tolerance. This is the range of tolerance for a population of trout to changes in water temperature. So what we're finding is that most trout like to live in this kind of optimum range of water temperatures, right? We have a couple of trout that can deal with a little bit higher water temperatures, a couple of trout that can deal with some lower water temperatures, but in general, the range here, or the tolerance, has to be in this optimum range, and that's where most of your trout live. Obviously, the lower limit, no organisms when water gets too cold, and no trout organisms when the water gets too hot. Again, that tolerance is kind of where in that zone, all right, most of your organisms are going to be able to live. And again, in this, it's kind of that medium temperature zone here for the trout. So we also have to talk now about something called J curves and S curves. So no population can grow indefinitely, but you're going to have some species that are going to reproduce much faster than others. So some species can reproduce exponentially. They reproduce at an early age. They have many offspring each time they reproduce. There are short intervals in between reproductive cycles. They produce a J-shaped curve of growth. Examples, bacteria and many insect species, right? Insects reproduce right away. They have many offspring, and they have very short intervals in their reproductive cycle. So they produce more of a J curve, or an exponential type curve of reproduction, right? This is a J-based curve, and I'm going to show you that right here. So this is your J. It looks like a J, right? We have time, population size, and that population size just grows exponentially. The other type of curve we have is called an S curve, and this is when population is growing logistically. So what happens in an S curve is you have a population that begins to grow, right? It has all these resources, so it starts to grow exponentially, but then what happens is it reaches the carrying capacity, or these limiting factors of resources that limit how large the population can grow, right? Maybe maybe it's the amount of food available, maybe it's the amount of sunlight available, or water, or things like that. So what happens is the J curve ends up turning into an S curve, right? Looks kind of like an S here, because again, you get this carrying capacity, or the limiting factors, and then the population kind of levels off. So that is logistic population growth, or an S curve. So population growth in nature is always limited. Again, we have the environmental resistance, which is the sum of all factors that limit population growth. That leads then to the carrying capacity, which we've talked about already in this class. The carrying capacity is the maximum population of a given species that a particular habitat can sustain indefinitely. And when you overshoot your carrying capacity, it could result in a population crash. So that's what happened here back in 1910. Some deer, white-tailed deer, were some reindeer, that were introduced to an area up in Michigan. And what they saw was, here was the carrying capacity, the amount of resources that really were around to support the reindeer population. But what happened is the reindeer population ended up going through exponential growth initially, and ended up getting so many reindeer in the area, well above the carrying capacity, that the resources couldn't support them, and therefore the population just crashed. All these reindeer ended up dying and not surviving. So this is what can happen if you have a huge overshoot of the carrying capacity. You end up getting a population crash on the other side, because again, the environment just can't sustain the amount of the population of organisms in the environment, because again, the resources are not there to support those organisms. So we have to talk now about two different types of species. So we talked about J curves and S curves. We're now going to talk about R-selected and K-selected species. So R-selected species are species with a capacity for high rate of population growth. These are going to be algae, bacteria, frogs, insects, many fish. They may go through irregular and unstable cycles in their population size because they just have a high rate of population growth. K-selected species are more like us, more like humans. We reproduce later in life. We don't have as many offspring. We have long lifespan. Examples, large mammals like us, whales, humans, birds of prey, and long-lived plants. K-selected species, however, are vulnerable to extinction because they don't have a lot of offspring and they produce later on in life. So here is a great chart showing traits on the left and then R-selected and K-selected species here. And my advice is to really understand most, if not all, of these traits, right? So reproductive potential, high in R-selected, low in K-selected. The population growth rate for R-selected is going to be fast, going to be that J curve, right? For K-selected, might be a little slower, might be more of that S curve. Time to reproductive maturity, short for R-selected, long for K-selected. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll notice population size, right, can be variable with lots of crashes with the R-selected because you have that J curve. You overshoot the carrying capacity so much and then the population crashes. But with the K-selected, you have more of that S curve, that more of that logistic growth where you get the quick growth, the exponential initially, and then we reach the carrying capacity and the growth kind of levels off there with the K-selected species, right? What's their role? R-selected are usually your prey. K-selected are usually your predators. So once again, great chart here. I would definitely understand what's going on here. Here's a case study about the white-tailed deer in the U.S. I'm sure you've seen plenty of white-tailed deer along the parkways and byways here in Westchester County. In 1900, deer habitat destruction and uncontrolled hunting. We almost became extinct, the white-tailed deer. But in the 20s and 30s, laws were enacted to protect the deer. The current deer population has now exploded in suburban areas, right? We're getting increased vehicle collisions, some Lyme disease as well. There are various methods out there to control the deer population, but especially in some of our more suburban areas like here in southern Westchester, definitely having a harder time controlling that deer population. And there the little guy is, that white-tailed deer here in the United States. All right, so last thing we're going to talk about, something called survivorship curves. This is species that vary in their lifespan. So this shows the percentages of members of a population that survive at different ages. And what you're going to see when I show you the curve in just a second is that our K-selected species usually have late loss, meaning most of the creatures in K-selected are born. They live through the younger years. They get into adolescent. They get to become adults, and then when they become elderly or older adults, they tend to die. Our selected species, and again, K-selected would be like us human beings. Our selected species would be like mosquitoes, right? All these mosquitoes hatch. Most of them die right away, either by other animals, predators, birds coming in and eating them or whatever. Most of your R-selected species, like your insects, are pretty much die right after they are born. And then you have constant loss like songbirds or like a squirrel that I'm going to show you, that kind of people die, or their population, right, of the constant loss will kind of die off gradually, just as many early as in middle age as in later in life. And that we consider a constant loss. So again, here's your example. The red is a late loss. Again, this would be an elephant or a human, a K-selected species. You'll notice we have the age here. This is percentage of people or of the population surviving, right? So we have most of your late loss surviving early on, and then as they get much older, they have a tendency to die off. That would be humans. Early loss, here we have dandelions, but again, mosquitoes, insects, right? They hatch, most of them die off, right? A few of them kind of live to reproduce. for the next generation. And then something like squirrels, constant loss, where it really doesn't matter where you are in age. You're losing just as many young squirrels as you are middle-aged squirrels as you are old squirrels. So those are kind of the survivorship curves. And again, just know and understand how to interpret them. And humans, not exempt from nature's population controls, right? In Ireland, potato crop destroyed by fungus in 1845 killed over 1 million people. The bubonic plague killed 25 million during the 14th century. And obviously, we just came out of COVID that killed many millions of people back a couple of years ago. Technological, social, and cultural changes have expanded Earth's carrying capacity for the human species today. But again, the big question is, how long will that be allowed to happen? How many humans can we really put on this planet before our carrying capacity has been met? And again, that's what we're talking about in this class, and that's what we will continue to talk about in this class as we go through the rest of the year. So that concludes my lecture on Chapter 7, Species Interactions, Ecological Succession, and Population Control. And as always, I thank you for listening.